It was November 16, 1961, and Nicolaos Spachidakis, second mate aboard a Greek freighter en route from Belgium to Texas called the Captain Theo, scanned the horizon as the ship passed through the Northwest Providence Channel. As he continued to scan the seemingly endless ocean in front of him, he spotted something that caught his attention. Sitting atop a white oblong lifeboat, alone amongst the infinite waves of the unmerciful ocean, was a young, beautiful, blonde-haired girl. Her face painfully sunburnt and gaunt. She would be proclaimed a miracle, this mysterious sea waif. But how did she end up in the middle of the ocean all alone? Welcome to What Are You Killing Me For?, a podcast exploring murder and mayhem on the water. This is Case 1, Episode 2, The Duperrault Family Massacre, A Small Miracle. I'm your host, Caroline. By chance, a Greek freighter called the Captain Theo was passing through the Northwest Providence Channel. On watch was Nicolaos Spachidakis, and he noticed a white speck that wasn't behaving like the other white specks out there, the other waves, and so he kept watching it. He thought it must be a small fishing dinghy, but then he realized that it couldn't be a fisherman out that far. Spachidakis called the ship's captain to the bridge, and they continued towards this vessel. To their absolute amazement, as they got closer, they realized that what they were seeing was actually not a fishing dinghy, but a small white oblong lifeboat, and, even more amazing, on it sat a beautiful blonde-haired girl. Captain ordered the engines to be shut off. He was afraid that the ship's lifeboats would cause too many waves, so the crew quickly improvised and they lashed together a bunch of oil drums to get to this girl. The captain then saw something really startling. He saw that she was being followed by sharks, and the sharks were now circling the raft. The crew yelled to the girl not to jump, and one of the crew members, Evangelos Kantzilas, lifted her up onto this makeshift raft. Once they made their way back to the ship, another crew member slipped a bowline under her arms and lifted her up onto the ship. Poor Terry Jo Duperrault was in bad shape. Her lips were swollen, her skin was badly burned, her cheeks were sunken from lack of food or water, and her blonde hair had turned white. And so that made it even harder for her to be spotted while she was out floating in the middle of the ocean. So all of these gruff, hardened Greek seamen gave this poor little girl slips of water, orange juice. They cooled her burnt skin with damp towels, and they even put Vaseline on her swollen lips. At this time, Terry Jo was just about comatose and wasn't really responsive. But the captain wanted to know who she was so they could help her, and he pressed Terry Jo about this, and he wanted to know how she got to be in the middle of the ocean. He was able to get her to indicate that she had been the sole survivor of something. And eventually she was able to whisper Bluebell and her name. The Coast Guard received a telegraph stating the following, quote, "Picked up blonde girl, brown eyes from small white raft, suffering exposure and shock. Name Terry Jo Duperrault. Was on Bluebell," end quote. So eventually a helicopter came from the Coast Guard station in Miami to pick Terry Jo up off of the Captain Theo, and she was taken to a hospital in Miami. And although she had been rescued, Terry Jo was severely dehydrated, and it would really be touch and go for a few days. So depending on the circumstances, the average person can go about 100 hours, 3 to 4 days without water. But this is in non-extreme conditions. So when you add this thin little body, so low body fat, sunburn, and the skin's exposure to salt water, and that time of survival decreases substantially. So really, when you look at it, there's no reason that Terry Jo should have survived this. So as Terry Jo was in the hospital recovering, the Coast Guard at first requested that an officer be placed outside of her room, just in case. So this takes us back to the Coast Guard Inquisition. on that Thursday morning. So Julian had finished up his account of the Bluebell tragedy when a Coast Guard captain named Captain Barber rushed into the room saying that he had incredible news. Well, that news was that Terry Jo had survived. Julian Harvey was shaken by this news. He left the Inquisition, and he wasn't interested at all in remaining for the rest of the Inquisition. He didn't want to cross-examine the boat's owner or anything like that. So Julian, after he left the Coast Guard station, he checked into the Sandman Hotel in Miami under the name John Monroe, and he checked in about 11 a.m. on Thursday, November 16th, 1961. When the maid showed up to clean Julian's room on Friday, November 17th, there was no answer. So she went in to clean, assuming that he had checked out or just wasn't there. And she noticed that there was some blood on one of the sheets. She also noticed a strange smell in the room. And as she got closer to the bathroom, that smell got stronger. So she went to the hotel manager and asked the hotel manager for some help, and he called the police. And a young patrol officer showed up, and he was able to get into the bathroom, which the maid hadn't been able to do. He was able to get into the bathroom, and as soon as he immediately recognized Julian Harvey. So Julian was covered in blood. He had slashed his thigh, then his ankles, wrists, forearms, and then he slashed his thigh again very deeply down to the bone and both sides of his neck. So, it seemed kind of obvious that this is the work of somebody who really, really hated himself. He left a suicide note that didn't mention anything about the Blue Bell, about his wife Dean, but he requested that he be buried at sea. So why did Julian Harvey commit suicide? What secrets might Terry Jo reveal? Well, before we get to that, let's take a quick break for our sponsor. This episode of What Are You Killing Me For?, a podcast exploring murder and mayhem on the water, is brought to you by Boat Unlimited, your one-stop internet shop for all things water, boat, ocean. They're pretty cool. So during the Coast Guard Inquisition, here's what Julian told the Coast Guard. He said that he and Dr. Duperrault had planned to make their way back to Florida from the Bahamas. So it was going to be about a 2-day sail. But between the two of them, remember that Dr. Duperrault was an experienced sailor, the two of them will be able to sail in shifts. Julian told the Coast Guard investigators that everyone was in the cockpit enjoying the sail. There was no power and it had been really beautiful out. He went on to say that the children had some, blankets and little pillows and were napping in the cockpit. Then, according to Julian Harvey, a squall hit the boat and caused the mainmast to snap and plummet into and through the 1-inch white pine of the deck of the Bluebell, and it continued on to pierce the bottom of the hull. This apparently caused the mizzenmast to break in 2 places, and then the mizzenmast collapsed among the group in the cockpit. Julian specifically indicated that that this was not caused by a failure of the stays or of those wires that stabilized the mast. Julian indicated that both Dean and Dr. Duperrault had been cut on their legs by splinters from the mast. This accident caused the sails to start to collapse, and so there were wires and sails all over the place. And so Julian said that he had to go to find some wire cutters. So he'd run up to the forecastle to get some of these cutters. And as he came out, he realized that a fire had started in the cockpit area. He claimed that the wind was traveling from the front of the sailboat towards the back, and the passengers were then moving aft. He gave the wheel to Dr. Duperrault, who, according to Harvey, kept the boat on course instead of turning it away from the wind and redirecting the fire. The deck had been painted right before the voyage with a highly flammable paint. The passengers then, according to Harvey, had jumped overboard, and Julian followed them. He was unable to find anyone but little Renee as he went, searching through the water in the dark. After about 2 hours, he gave up looking. He indicated that he'd given Renee CPR and that he had just screamed himself hoarse looking for everyone. Eventually, Harvey was picked up by the Gulf Lion. So the Coast Guard investigators found a number of things about Harvey's account a little off. First, if you remember from the last episode, Harvey stated that he didn't even think about the flares and didn't see them. He didn't think to grab them before he got off the boat, right? Which is kind of a weird thing for somebody who is an experienced sailor. The fact that he had thrown the carbide light overboard without turning it on was odd to them, in that he didn't hoist the sail on the dinghy that he was rescued out of. All right, so remember that Terry Jo is recovering in the Miami hospital. Julian Harvey has committed suicide in a motel in Miami. Over the next 7 days following Terry Jo's rescue, she would be slowly nursed back to health by Dr. Franklin Verdon. The first 36 hours were critical. Terry Jo was in a coma, and her heart rate was way too fast. It was really weak, and it was erratic. Her kidneys were damaged from her severe dehydration, and her blood pressure was really, really low, far too low. But by the second day of the hospital, she'd come out of her coma and seemed like she was recovering very quickly. By Monday, November 20th, she was doing much better and was able to undergo her first interview with the Coast Guard investigators. And so she gave a short interview until the doctor saw she was getting agitated and sent the investigators off. By Tuesday, November 21st, Terry Jo, her body fluids had been replaced and she was eating again. So she was way better. And it was by this Tuesday, November 21st, that Terry Jo had revealed her entire ordeal. So the crew of the Captain Theo heard that Terry Jo had lost her favorite doll on the Bluebell. And so they sent her this huge blonde doll to replace the one that she did lose. By Thanksgiving, Terry Jo's physical recovery was complete. But this poor kid, she'd just lost her entire family, had been lost at sea for 4 days, and she was worried about how she was going to pay the hospital bills and how she would get back to Wisconsin by herself to take care of herself. It became apparent very quickly that Terry Jo's account of what happened that night on the Bluebell was very different than what Julian Harvey's account was. When asked if she had been, as Julian stated, asleep on her mother's lap in the cockpit when the mast broke, Terry Jo said that this was absolutely wrong. She said that she had gone down to the room that she and Renee shared to sleep and was awoken by a screaming voice. So it took her a minute to wake up and orient herself, and she went on to say that when she woke up that night, it was her brother she heard screaming, "Help, Daddy, help." So Terry Jo went up to investigate, and she found her mother and brother lying in a pool of blood in the main cabin. She continued towards the cockpit, and she saw more blood pooled on the starboard side of the cockpit. She saw Harvey and asked him what was happening, and he screamed at her, told her to go back downstairs, shoving her down the stairs. And Terry Jo noted that when he did this, his right eye was rolling crazily and that he just terrified her. So Terry Jo did exactly what she was told and went down and cowered in her room for as long as she could. And after a few minutes, Harvey came down with what she thought was a rifle. He looked at her and then he just simply left. So Terry Jo waited for as long as she could, but eventually an oily water started to fill the cabin and she had to leave. Terry Jo said that the mast did not break and that there was no fire, but there was a strong smell of oil. Once she made it back to the cockpit, she saw Harvey and asked him if the boat was sinking, and he told her yes. And then he threw her a line to the dinghy and told her to hold it, but she was so just stunned that she dropped it. And when Harvey got back, he saw that she dropped it and he dove into the water after the dinghy and he left her alone. Somehow, amazingly, Terry Jo kept her cool and found this oblong cork life float that was attached to the side of the cockpit, I think it was. There were some crazy knots on it, and she had to calm herself down enough to be able to untie these knots. So she got this life float off and was able to get it into the water just in time. However, the life float got snagged on the Bluebell as it was sinking, and it momentarily pulled her under. But thank God she popped back up. She was terrified that Harvey was going to find her, so she cowered down as low as she could, as quietly as she could, in that life float, just scared out of her mind. So Terry Jo told the Coast Guard investigators that there had not been a squall, nor had the mast been broken. The sails were not stowed properly, but instead they were splayed like all over the deck. Terry Jo also dispelled Harvey's claim that there was a fire. And so after her second interview with them, the Coast Guard investigators were convinced that Terry Jo was telling the truth. This poor kid underwent a horrific ordeal. So she had just witnessed these awful events and saw the dead body of her brother and mother. She didn't know the fate of her father or her younger sister. Now, she was adrift on an unstable float that was not meant to support a full body weight. So this life float, and I'll post some pictures on social media and on the website that shows it, but it's about 2.5 feet by 5 feet. It's got cork around the outside. It's white, and then it's got some ropes on the inside. And really what it's meant for is for a bunch of adults or people or whatever to hold on to it, not to sit on top of it. Terry Jo described that first night, which was Sunday, November 12th. She describes it as this feeling of unreal vastness, like she was in some sort of cosmic dream. So she was totally isolated. And isolation can affect the human brain incredibly, incredibly profoundly, especially in a young brain. You know, the brain does not fully develop, well, at least the executive functioning part, the frontal lobe, doesn't fully develop until you're about 25. So at 11, the effects of this isolation would be huge. And after several days, even worse. So Boston psychiatrist Stuart Gracian wrote about the effects of solitary confinement on the juvenile brain. And although she was not in solitary confinement, I would imagine it was a similar effect, the being alone in the middle of the ocean. Gracian wrote that even a few days of solitary confinement will predictably shift the EEG pattern towards an abnormal pattern characteristic of stupor and dilemma. So for most people, being totally alone for days on end would be an incredibly traumatic experience. At night, Terry Jo was freezing, and during the day she was exposed to oppressive heat and sunburn. On top of that, a pair of parrotfish followed her for days, biting at her rear and her legs. So I didn't know what a parrotfish was, so I had to look it up. They are terrifying looking. They're fish that have like a bird's beak at the end of them. And they just harassed her. And in the book Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean, talks about how she reacted to these parrotfish, that she would get so frustrated with them that she would yell at them and splash them and stuff. So she still had a lot of spunk. By Monday night, she fell asleep, and when she was asleep, she slipped off the float, but thankfully her arm was still clutching the float, so she was able to climb back on. Tuesday, she saw planes overhead, one of which seemed to be doing search patterns above, but since she would blend in that white dinghy and her blonde hair blend in with the sea caps, she would have been really hard to spot. Terry Jo's raft was floating in the Northwest Providence Channel, and the winds were pushing her float into the west-northwest direction of the current. If she wasn't rescued soon, she would have drifted into the Gulf Stream. So she actually was likely protected from predators in the ocean because her clothes and the float had soaked up oil from the Bluebell. For a little while, she was kept company by a pod of pilot whales, and this is a species of large dolphin. They're predators, but they hunt squid. So by Tuesday night, she had begun to hallucinate. By Wednesday, any residual hunger that she had felt was gone. Her eyes ached from the sun, from the salt, and her body ached. She hallucinated more and more and eventually became comatose, suffering from mild convulsions. By Thursday morning, November 16th, her body was shutting down. Her kidneys lost function and she was in and out of consciousness. But closing in on her was a black, shadowy structure, the Captain Theo. Could things have happened the way Julian Harvey said? Bluebell's owner, Harold Pegg, had purchased the Bluebell recently after doing a great deal of research and after having the Bluebell thoroughly inspected. Based on this, Pegg did not believe that the mainmast could have failed from a defect as Julian claimed. There could not have been a fire because the mainmast could not have fallen straight down. The wind would have pushed it to the side. If there had been a fire, all Julian would have had to do was to pull the release to the CO2 fire suppression system, which was in the cockpit. Julian told members of the Gulf Lion and a ton of other people that the Duperraults, Arthur and Jean, were killed outright by the failing rig. But at the hearing, or the Coast Guard inquest, he said that the passengers were merely injured. The Gulf Lion crew members, and remember these are the guys that picked up Julian, they noted that Julian seemed awfully calm and cool, considering he'd just lost his wife. Julian made no attempt to send word to his wife's family or the family of the Duperraults. He seemed anxious that a search might find survivors and actually argued against a search. The crew wondered why Julian had no blood on him, considering he'd been surrounded by bleeding people in the cockpit. The crew smelled no smoke on Julian or on Renee's body, and they found flares virtually in plain sight in a bag in the raft. Renee's body, to them, seemed too soft for her to have been dead for 12 hours. There are 4 stages that a body goes through after death. The first one is called pallor mortis, and that's when the face becomes pale, all the blood kind of rushes out. The second one is algor mortis, and that is as the body cools and it starts to take on the temperature of whatever the environment is around it. So after death, the body will first go flaccid, so it'll become limp and mushy. And then rigor mortis will begin to set in. And rigor mortis is when all the muscles contract and then they stay in this contracted position. Rigor mortis can last, it kind of depends. It usually starts within 2 hours of death, and typically it can be completed by about 8 hours. This is not fixed though. This can vary based on temperature, other environmental or external sorts of factors. The longest range that studies have indicated rigor mortis can last is 18 hours to 2 days. And then the final stage of death is livor mortis, and that's when the blood kind of pools in whatever places are lowest. So whether or not Renee's body was the right, consistency doesn't sound right, but was the right sort of feel for having been dead 12 hours. It's hard to say. Heat will speed up this process of death. Heat speeds it up. So also, one crewman saw that he saw that a gas can sinking in the water near the dinghy as the Gulf Line came closer. And some of the crewmen actually saw motor marks on the dinghy, like there had been a motor attached to the back of the dinghy that had been just removed. Some of the other things that would tell you that Julian's account was not right was that Julian Harvey's dinghy traveled 8 miles in about 12 hours. Okay, Terry Joe floated 18 miles in almost 4 days. So we're talking a huge difference. So how did Julian Harvey's dinghy travel so far? The harbor boat pilot who took Julian Harvey and Renee's body to Nassau stated that there were bruises on Renee's forehead. And that could be the result of many things. It could be the result of livor mortis if she was facing down while traveling. According to the book Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean by Dr. Richard Logan, here's what might have happened. He thinks that Harvey wanted to kill his wife for the insurance money. And we're going to talk a little bit about old Julian Harvey here in just a few moments. He thinks that Julian likely attempted to stab his wife to death in their cabin, and then he was going to throw her body over the side when everyone is asleep to make it look like she had fallen overboard. But Dean may have fought back and scratched Julian. There were signs of a struggle on Julian later, scratches on his arms and I think somewhere on his face as well. Arthur may have heard the struggle and come out to see what was going on. And as he came out to check things out, he was confronted by Harvey, who then maybe stabbed him to death on the forward deck. Jean, Dr. Duperrault's wife, sees this happening and she runs towards her husband, but Julian turned on her as well. As Jean rushes to the cockpit to grab Renee to protect her, Harvey stabs Jean and wounds her. Maybe Renee is hit on the head or falls and hits her head, who knows. Jean, wounded, staggers or falls down into the main cabin. Brian is awoken by the sound of his mother and screams for his father. Julian stabs Brian, who then falls dead next to his mother. Terry Jo hears the commotion, but at first, she's frozen in fear. So she finally enters the cockpit, after she'd seen all of this happening, and Julian sends her back down, and eventually she had to leave. She had to leave the Bluebell and save herself. So who was this Julian Harvey? Was he capable of committing such a massacre? Well, let's look at his childhood a little bit. Julian Harvey was born in New York City in 1917. His parents divorced when he was just a year old. His mother was actually a chorus girl. And when he was about 6, his mother married a well-known vaudeville producer, and they were doing really well. As a child, Julian was physically weak, and he had an awful stammer and a lazy eye, both of which would worsen when he was agitated. When the Depression hit and the hub of entertainment moved from New York to Hollywood, his mother and stepfather lost everything. And so they sent him to live with a wealthy aunt and uncle in Scarsdale when he was about 13. His aunt doted on him, and they took really good financial care of him. Well, Julian, despite his weak physical weakness and his stammer and lazy eye, he was very handsome. And he worked on his physical appearance, his physique, by working out. He became a gymnast. He had a very high IQ. As Julian continued to build up his physical appearance, he realized that he was good looking, and he became quite the ladies' man. His first marriage occurred when he was still in high school, but his aunt and uncle had that marriage annulled within a year. Julian then graduated from high school in 1937. He then went to the University of North Carolina and then to Purdue for a little bit, but he joined the Army Air Corps in August of 1941. Julian was quite the ladies' man. He was incredibly good-looking and charming. He was reportedly an excellent dresser and sophisticated. He did some professional modeling at some point, and every time he was going to have his picture taken, he managed to get his shirt off. So I posted some photos on social media and on the website if you want to see a shirtless Julian Harvey. In 1941, Julian Harvey was sent to Eglin Air Force Base. And Eglin Air Force Base is located in the Florida Panhandle. And it was during his time here that he met and then married Ethel Full, who is a 17-year-old from a wealthy South Florida family. In 1942, Julian was sent to England to fly B-24s across the English Channel. So the B-24 was the first aircraft to cross the Atlantic. It was difficult to fly and had poor low-speed performance, and it was rapidly phased out by the end of World War II. Then in 1943, Julian was then sent to Libya, and he flew missions across the Mediterranean against Nazi-controlled South Europe. He flew a total of 30 missions, One of these missions was the raid on Ploustai, the Ploustai oil fields in Romania. I'm probably massacring that pronunciation. But those oil fields, those were Hitler's oil fields, and so that was a big deal. Later reports, though, showed that Julian reported that he had engine problems right before this raid, and so it didn't look like he actually participated in the raid. Well, while Julian was overseas, his second wife, Ethel, gave birth to his first son, Julian Jr. Ethel moved in with Julian's aunt and uncle, but for, I think, like 2 weeks or something. But eventually Julian's aunt drove Ethel out because she didn't think Ethel was good enough for her nephew. In January of 1944, Harvey returned to Eglin Air Force Base. Shortly after he returned, he asked Ethel for a divorce, and he told her, "You can keep the baby." So I don't think he ever had any contact with Julian Jr. again. When Julian Harvey was stationed at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, he owned a 70-foot schooner for about a year, but had to sell it for some reason. Then in 1945, Julian became a test pilot. Julian became a test pilot in 1945. He won the Air Medal for actions as a B-24 test pilot when he ditched the plane for an audience. So it was during a test of a new reinforcement for the B-24 that Harvey and his co-pilot crashed the plane into the water. They were able to survive. So first, the co-pilot climbs out. Next, Julian climbs out, and this should tell you a little bit about the ego on Julian. So he climbs out second, he stands up on top of the plane, pulls a comb out of his shirt pocket, and runs it through his hair like, that's no big deal, I'm good. Julian had a very powerful reputation, and obviously, not only did he earn it, but he also cultivated it in these ways. One of his fellow pilots said of Julian later, quote, "Because of his wartime record in those early days, his good looks and his many decorations, he had a very egotistical air. He wore the special cut Eisenhower jacket, pearl pink chino trousers, and a yellow scarf. Harvey was considered a hero, and no one challenged him in his wearing of this unconventional uniform." So Julian was then sent to several other bases, but eventually he was assigned a desk job at the Pentagon. But he was restless, so he went back to Purdue and finished his bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering in 1948. On September 18, 1947, the U.S. Air Force was formed as a separate branch of the Armed Forces under the National Security Act of 1947. In 1948, Julian, now 31, met and married his third wife, 21-year-old socialite named Joan Boylan, with whom he had his second son, Lance, in 1948. Well, during their marriage, Julian had multiple affairs, and Joan would sometimes call him on it, and when she would, he would get very, very angry. So one night on April 21st, 1949, Julian, Joan, and Joan's mother were driving home on a wet road. It had been raining, and the car skidded into a bridge railing and plunged into a bayou. Harvey escaped uninjured because he saw the accident coming, and at the last minute, he opened his door and jumped out. He made no effort to attempt to rescue the women who were trapped underwater. Later, witnesses said that Julian was just standing on the bridge watching while others dove into the water trying to save the women, and that he was oddly calm and was boasting about how easy it was for him to escape. When divers later went to retrieve the bodies of the women, they noted that the doors were all closed, but that the driver's side window was down. After this accident happened, a doctor, not a psychiatrist, but a regular medical doctor, not that psychiatrists aren't medical doctors, but made some conclusions about Harvey. From the book A Lone Orphaned on the ocean. Quote, this doctor, quote, he concluded in 1949 that underneath Harvey's veneer of charm and sophistication was an amoral man with no real empathy for others, a man who could be dangerous. In other words, a possible sociopath. So more than a decade before the Blue Bell, someone had seen a darker side of Harvey's persona, end quote. Investigators found this car accident to be suspicious. Shortly following the accident, Julian collected his wife's life insurance policy, and within weeks he was living with another woman. Julian was then transferred to Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, where he met and married his fourth wife, Jitty, in 1950. Jitty was a businesswoman, strong-willed. Jitty was interviewed after the Blue Bell incident, and she talked about how egotistical Julian was, and she also spoke of his violent temper. She also was led to believe that she was Julian's second wife, not his third. 3 months after he and Jitty were married, Julian was sent to Korea to fly Sabre jets, and in Korea he flew 114 missions. In 1951, some of Julian's colleagues were beginning to think that he was psychologically troubled and had begun to appear scared and anxious. Not a great trait for a fighter pilot. When he returned from Korea in 1953, he asked Jitty for a divorce. But while going through the divorce proceedings, Julian had the audacity to ask out the lawyer's secretary. And, he was good looking and charming, and although she found it strange, she said yes and went out with him on one date. But she refused a second date because something about him made her uneasy. During his time in the military, Julian had more engine failures than any of his peers. He had a reputation of impressing his superiors, but he raised the eyebrows of his peers. In fact, according to a passage in the book Alone, Orphaned at Sea, quote, when Harvey left Korea in mid-1953, it had become clear that he, at the very least, had severe anxiety problems. He exhibited facial muscular tics, a rolling right eye, and stammering to the point that many now were seriously aware of his problem with nerves, end quote. By 1953, Julian's anxiety was now hard to ignore, and he was sent to the Pentagon to work, no longer able to fly. Apparently, with a lot of time on his hands, in 1954, Julian married his fifth wife, Georgiana. Georgiana was from a wealthy family. And Julian shared with her that he wanted to pursue another of his lifelong dreams of becoming a ship's captain. And so in 1954, he and Georgiana bought a boat called the Torbatros, and later this boat would sink. So in 1955, Harvey and a few of his friends took his sailboat, the Torbatros, out traveling to Florida I'm not sure where from, but they talk about how this particular thing happened in the Chesapeake Bay. So I'm guessing that he was, coming from Virginia or somewhere up along the eastern shore. So while they were in the Chesapeake Bay, Julian rammed into a submerged wreckage of an old battleship, the Texas. And this battleship had been underwater since 1921, and it was a known navigational hazard marked by a buoy. One of the passengers said that Julian circled the wreckage twice before he ran into it. He and the rest escaped, but the Torbatros sank. So Julian received a $14,258 claim from the U.S. government, and he collected insurance money from his coverage of the Torbatros. In 1955, he was sent back to Eglin Air Force Base to be a senior test pilot, and this is after he'd fought really hard to fly again. In January of 1957, while he was testing the F-86H Sabre, his engine flamed out and he had to eject, which resulted in a severe shoulder injury. He and Georgiana had purchased an 81-foot yawl named the Valiant with the insurance money from the Torbatros, and they sailed it along with their son Lance around the Gulf Coast while Julian recovered. Once he was recovered, he was sent to Edwards Air Force Base in California, and although he was no longer on flight duty, he kept his pilot certification up by flying still occasionally. So it was in 1958 when Harvey and a younger pilot went out to fly a T-33 trainer. And this T-33 trainer had engine failure and both pilots had to eject. This time, Julian was seriously injured, and he was treated for severe anxiety and muscle twitching. And apparently, when he was in the hospital, he was yelling, "I'm so sick of this." It was then that Julian admitted that he had begun to crack up in Korea. So after serving in the Air Force for 19 years, he was medically discharged in March of 1958. So he was retired with a pension that was based on his lower rank of major and not of a temporary rank that he had held, which was lieutenant colonel. But Julian was a fighter, and so he fought, and eventually he was awarded 60% of his base pay as a lieutenant colonel. In 1958, Harvey was captaining his 80-foot luxury yawl Valiant off of the coast of Cuba. And when they were off the coast of Cuba, about 10 miles, the Valiant caught fire. He and the crewmen abandoned the boat, and the boat was insured for $40,000 by its owner. So using the insurance money from the sinking of the Valiant, Harvey bought a 70-foot schooner called the White Swan, and he ran a fairly successful charter business to the Bahamas for a while. During this time, there were rumors that Julian was running guns and ammo to Castro, Cuba. So in 1959, Georgiana sued Julian for divorce based upon extreme mental cruelty. And then after that, Julian ended up in Fort Lauderdale, where he worked as a boat captain. So around this time, evidently the law enforcement was hip to this insurance fraud thing that was going on, and they called their investigation of it Sinking Inc. So what had been happening was that boats were being sunk to get insurance settlements. So Julian Harvey was quite the bachelor, cruising around Fort Lauderdale, working as a boat captain, when he met his sixth wife. Her name was Mary Dean Jordan, and she went by Dean. They were married on July 26, 1961. Dean was a former TWA flight attendant, and she was an aspiring writer. And I posted the only picture I could find of her on social media and on the website. Julian and Dean argued frequently, once they even called off their wedding. Their most recent argument before the Bluebell Charter was because Dean had promised her brothers that she would send $25 a month to help with her ailing father's care. And that comes from Life magazine, the December 1st, 1961 issue. Let's take another quick break to hear a trailer from another podcast.
Because I'm not a lizard, I'm not come under a rock. I came out of her vagina, came out of my mother. And in a rage, I went right back in.
SkB, Dissecting the Serial Killer's Brain, a true crime podcast. Are you fascinated by the macabre? Oddly obsessed with serial killers? Have you contemplated what it is that leads to the unspeakable depravity exhibited by serial killers like Ed Kemper, Jeffrey Dahmer, Anthony Sowell, or Danny Rawling? Serial killers captivate us. The horror they wreak fascinates us, for we want to understand why they do what they do. They make us question humanity. I am your host, Caroline, a university biology professor and true crime junkie. Join me on my quest to understand evil. Throughout each episode, I will explore the psychological and physiological elements that contributed to the creation of these monsters. I will tackle the question of nature versus nurture in everyday language, providing simple explanations of complex cognitive and biological processes that shape the brains of some of the world's most heinous serial killers. Episodes dissecting the brains of Ed Kemper and Jeffrey Dahmer are available now on all of your favorite podcatcher. Just search SK. Follow me on most of your social media platforms at SkB Pod, or visit my website at www.skbpod.com for more information about the show. Julian Harvey was accident prone. Or were they accidents? He was involved in 3 plane crashes while he was in the Air Force. 2 were accidental and 1 was a test. Harvey sank 2 of his own boats, and 2 wives died violently in his company. Was he an insurance scammer? There were a ton of rumors surrounding Julian among the Miami sailing community. Around this time, there was a boat sinking racket that was going on where people were sinking boats for insurance money, and they were also sinking boats to run Cuban refugees. So what that means is the boats would make several runs picking up wealthy Cubans, and then they would be sunk before they started to get attention from law enforcement agencies. One investigator said that everywhere he looked when he was looking at these insurance scams, everywhere he investigated, Julian Harvey's name came up. So this, coupled with the insurance claims that Julian had collected on the Torbatros and the Valiant, meant that Harvey was under intense scrutiny before he even met or married Dean. One Miami detective proposed that Julian was smuggling drugs into the U.S. from Cuba. The detective thought that Julian had met up with another boat late at night in order to pick up some contraband to smuggle into Florida. He said shortly before midnight, Julian had put out a radio call with his position. The detective said he got this information from a ham operator in the Bahamas, but the Coast Guard could never verify it. This detective thought that Arthur, or Dr. Duperrault, may have walked out onto the deck when a transfer was happening, and that Julian panicked and killed him and then the others to protect himself. But why then would he kill his wife? Apparently, Harold Pegg, and then later his sons, were drug smugglers since at least the 1970s. I couldn't find any info about if they were smuggling drugs back in the 60s. So the most likely motive for the Bluebell tragedy was some combination of too many insurance scams and being found out for some other indiscretion, such as assisting Cuba or smuggling drugs. I don't think anyone would disagree that Julian Harvey was probably not the most moral of characters, and that likely he did have something to do pretty profoundly with the Bluebell tragedy. Well, what happened to Terry Jo? Well, Terry Jo felt that she survived for a reason, and this really seems to be the case due to the fact that she nearly died at least 8 different times over the 4-day ordeal she endured. She returned to Green Bay on November 30th, 1961 to live with her aunt and uncle. Terry Jo lived in a bedroom in her grandmother's apartment that was attached to her aunt and uncle's home. She and her grandmother became even closer, and her grandmother taught her all those important things that a young woman in the 1960s needs to know, right? Cooking, sewing, knitting. But one of the problems that Terry Jo encountered was that everyone knew what happened to her, but nobody spoke about it, which I don't think this was an entirely uncommon approach in the 1960s. Terry Jo did not speak about her ordeal for 19 years, and it took another 6 years after that, so 25 years before she was able to express how angry she was. There was a conspiracy of silence that encapsulated her, and it prevented her from developing deep, close personal connections with others, even her family. Terry Jo had survivor's guilt. She developed an intense fear of blood and dark water. Later, she suffered from depression and other classic signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. At age 12, Terry Jo changed her name to Terry, and that might sound, what? So her name prior was Terry Jo, Terry, and then J-O, and she changed her name to Terry, Tere. And this allowed her to escape from the poor, brave little Terry Jo who was a victim. This changing of her name allowed her to get some control back. Terry, at 16, decided to go away to private school and start over. She had a sizable trust fund from the accident, so she was able to do this. Well, while she was away, she fell in love for the first time, and the love was not requited. And this sent her over the emotional edge, and she moved back in with her aunt and uncle and actually saw a psychotherapist for a while. After finishing high school, Terry went to university and selected a school that had a Spanish study abroad program. In the summer of 1971, Terry met her first husband, John, whom she married 3 weeks after they met. They had a daughter in 1974, but they divorced not long after that. Terry went to Florida with her daughter Brooke to live with her ex-husband John, his family, which included 4 of her brothers. She was really close to John's family. She then met a man named Spencer, had a baby with him, Blair, and they got married in 1976. Next came her son Brian in 1978. But in 1978, Terry's grandmother died, which was really tragic because they were very close. In 1979, Spencer was transferred to Germany, and their marriage, which hadn't been real great, continued to sort of decline. She found out later that Spencer had had a drug problem. So she was setting up a pediatrician's or pediatric appointment for her children, and she was filling out the paperwork about, her parents or whatever. And when the doctor saw that she marked both of her parents were deceased, he asked what happened to them. And she told him. It was then that Terry finally talked to somebody about her ordeal. Terry left Germany and she divorced Spencer. And after a few years, she met and married another man who had a really dark secret that threatened her children. He was a convicted pedophile. She didn't know that. Her kids tried to tell her that the man was creepy and inappropriate, but Terry didn't believe them until later he was arrested for child molestation in town. He hadn't harmed her children, thankfully, but she and the children then fled. Over time, she began to move past her struggles, although she had never, she had never fallen victim to drug abuse, or did she really complain about her life, but she still had a lot of struggles. In the 1980s, Terry met Dr. Richard Logan, who helped her tell her story later. Terry became close friends with her boss at the time, a man named Ron Fassbender. He helped her through her difficulties and was really her best friend. Eventually, she moved to North Carolina. I think it was like 95. She moved to North Carolina to be close to the family of her first husband. But she missed Ron terribly and called him and told him, and they've been together ever since that Thanksgiving of 1995. In 1999, Terry wanted to prove once and for all that the story she told about that night on the Blue Bell was the truth. So she agreed to a sodium amytal interview, which is true serum. The results of the interview was that she had told the truth and had not repressed anything. Well, where is Terry now? Well, as of the publishing of Alone, Orphaned at Sea by Dr. Richard Logan, in 2009, she's finally at peace. She has 3 grandchildren and a wonderful husband. And in addition to that, her ordeal was the foundation for what is an incredible legacy. So it's not generally known that the widespread use of the international orange that we now take for granted on life rafts and dinghies and things is due to the ordeal of this brave young girl from Green Bay. She was alone and almost invisible on the high seas on a tiny white craft. Since that change was made, untold numbers of others who would have been lost at sea have been found. What Are You Killing Me For? Is a bi-weekly podcast produced in collaboration with Boat Unlimited, your one-stop internet hub for anything that your water-obsessed soul may want or need. Follow the podcast on most of your social media platforms at Water Killing, or visit the show's website at www.waterkilling.com. Join me in 2 weeks as I discuss another exciting case. Don't forget to subscribe to What Are You Killing Me For on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spreaker, Podcast Republic, SoundCloud, any of your podcatchers. And if you enjoy this podcast, please take a minute to rate and review. Share with your friends. And subscribe to my other podcast, SkB, Dissecting the Serial Killer's Brain. This is a podcast in which I discuss the biological and psychological factors that led to such monsters as Ed Kemper, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Anthony Sowell. Until next time, roll on, deep and dark blue ocean roll. 10,000 fleets sweep over thee in vain. Man marks the earth with ruin, but his control stops with the shore.